as a wonderful introduction, and thanks everyone for joining me today. I've never given a talk sitting down, so this is a bit of a new experience for me. But I wanted to give you a sense of, I guess, a theme across many of the different research initiatives that I have done in the last few years and have ongoing. Not to say that they're all tightly connected, but as one way of thinking about the types of questions that I address and the way that I approach them. And in particular, it really hinges on doing science that addresses interesting questions, but importantly that is relevant to management and conservation decisions, so that the science gets used and hopefully that better decisions are made to help kind of manage and protect the oceans. So I'll give you these examples always through that lens and hopefully show you some evidence of that kind of impact happening and sort of translating science into real-world solutions. So one of the main themes to the research that I do is trying to understand the limits to the way that ocean ecosystems operate and the way that we impact them and the benefits they provide. So I'll walk you through some examples that focus on identifying or trying to identify these types of limits, and then how do we measure them so that we can use those limits to make decisions, and then some examples where we actually try to map where those limits might exist so that decisions that are based on particular places, which is most decisions, can get information that is tailored to that particular location. So not everything can be mapped and gets mapped in the work that I do, but I found it to be a really valuable tool for science to produce this spatially mapped information. So these are 6 broad themes or topics, initiatives that my research currently focuses on, and I'll walk you through each of them very briefly. There's much more depth to each of them, but I want to, again, look at it through this lens of understanding limits. So it ranges from the idea of multiple stressors on marine ecosystems. How do we measure the impact of human activities and the impact of our management decisions on the health of the oceans? How do we feed the planet within the limits of what ocean ecosystems can produce? How is climate change affecting ocean ecosystems, and where might there be limits around that? How does the issue of social equity and sort of needs of all people on the planet constrain or limit the way that we think about conservation decisions? And then these ideas of tipping points or thresholds where systems will dramatically change, and what can we do about that? But I want to first put this into sort of the global context. You may be familiar with Johan Rockström and his colleagues' work on planetary boundaries. This was released almost a decade ago and has really had a profound influence on international policy for thinking about the way that people are affecting our planet at a global scale. And these are sort of 9 general categories of things that the Earth system produces and provides for people, and the impact we're having on these parts of the system that might be pushing up against these planetary boundaries. And with some collaborators, we recently wanted to extend this framework to thinking about oceans. If you look at this work from Johan Rockström and his colleagues and this figure they produced, it's really focused on the land and the atmosphere. Ironically, since the ocean makes up 2/3 of the planet and is fundamentally important to climate regulation and our atmospheric processes, they hadn't really paid attention to the oceans. And so we use the same framework of these 9 categories, but wanted to point out how thinking about the oceans can really change the way that you identify and measure these planetary boundaries. So some of it can just be things like with novel entities, the fact that there's a huge problem with plastic pollution in the oceans. If you're not paying attention to that, you're missing a key part of how humans are affecting our planet and where those boundaries might be. And the paper goes into examples of how you can either add new information or expand the focus of these different boundaries to better incorporate ocean ecosystems into our sense of how we're affecting the planet. But it also changes our understanding of where we may be within these limits or these boundaries. And those arrows are just to give a sense of the uncertainty we have around where these boundaries may be when you start to account for ocean ecosystems and the conditions of those ocean ecosystems. It's really hard to get actual data to measure where we are. Even the original planetary boundaries information was heuristic rather than specific in where these boundaries are. So this isn't an example of measuring where these boundaries are, but more about identifying how we can think about ocean ecosystems and planetary boundaries to better address the way that we're affecting our oceans. Others have also really highlighted how the planetary boundaries framework ignored the fact that the reason that we are pushing up against some of these boundaries is that people need to use the planet just to live, and we can't keep people from using natural resources unless we're willing to disproportionately affect a huge part of the planet. So the global poor, have no other choice in a lot of cases but to use these resources. So there's this sort of social foundation, or what we call a safe and just space. So the safe is staying within the outer boundaries, and the just or equitable part of it is allowing for all people to have some access to these resources. So you get sort of a donut here of where we are trying to be in terms of how we are interacting with and using our planet that allows for all people to benefit, but not at the cost of the sustainability of our planet. Again, measuring these things and certainly mapping them is really difficult, but identifying them as issues and thinking about it as a mindset or a heuristic to think about how we make decisions can be really powerful. And this framing of thinking about these issues has been really influential to the way that I've been doing a lot of my research recently. So I'll start giving just a brief insight into some of the work we've been doing on this idea of ocean tipping points. So if you're not familiar with this idea, the idea of an ecological tipping point is when you have small or incremental changes in the way that we are using or impacting the environment that lead to much larger changes in the system. So these nonlinear threshold responses where you can get dramatic, often unexpected changes in the system. Obviously, if it tips into a state we don't want, these are the kinds of things that we want to avoid. So identifying where these thresholds might be, ideally measuring them and then staying away from them is really, really important for a lot of management and a huge scientific challenge. So this large project was trying to learn from past examples of where these tipping points have been identified, synthesize across them, and provide guidance or best practices to managers when trying to think about managing their ocean ecosystems to avoid tipping points that are not of value to people. So you are likely familiar with this classic example from Jim Estes and the way that sea otters influence kelp forest and sea urchin barrens. He's studied these in California and Alaska. And over decades of work, he and his colleagues have shown that when sea otters are present and they're eating the sea urchins, you get really low levels of sea urchin density, the x-axis there, which allows kelp forests to thrive. But if you remove the sea otters, you get a trophic cascade, the sea urchins blossom, take over, and you get these urchin barrens. And there's a real threshold response tipping point here that he and his colleagues have shown that when you get an otter density below about 6 or 7 individuals per kilometer, you get this shift into an urchin barren. So here's an example where he was actually able to identify and measure and to some degree map where these tipping points occur, but it was difficult, and you can see there's uncertainty around that. And the other thing that he found is that there's this, what they call hysteresis or path dependency, where getting the system to tip back into a kelp forest requires many more sea otters in place to really reduce the urchin population low enough to allow the kelp to recover. So there's additional challenges in identifying these thresholds, that there's not always a single threshold. There's a tipping point of decline and then a different threshold of recovery. So it just challenges the science to inform management to be able to identify and ideally measure both of these types of thresholds. Well, this large project, 5-year project, basically came to the conclusion that we do not know enough to even come close to being able to identify, let alone measure, all of these tipping points in every different type of marine ecosystem in every different location around the planet. Maybe not so surprising. So what we ended up trying to come up with is sort of a best practice or a heuristic around how to think about this. So the blue line is sort of the trajectory of your ecosystem state with that kind of tipping point where it goes from a desired state or regime on the left into your undesired state in a nonlinear way on the right. And that red line is sort of where you think the tipping point might be, but you have uncertainty around that, so that's the red band. And then to make sure you don't screw things up and mess up, you build in a precautionary buffer. And so your safe operating space is that dark green area. And so the management target is to allow for use of the system up until that change between your safe operating space and your precautionary buffer, but to not go past that. Okay, so this is really common sense. But what does that mean in terms of practice? Well, you should have some indicators that you're heading towards this tipping point. For example, you might see declining catches in the fish that you're harvesting or the species that you're harvesting. That suggests you're starting to move away from your safe space towards your precautionary buffer. And then you might see later, as you're pushing things further, that there's real shifts in the structure of the food web. That's further indication that you're getting closer and closer to your tipping point. And the last example, you might get recruitment failures of key species. You're really close to your tipping point and you need to be a lot more careful. And this then guides your understanding of the risk of your tipping point and what you might do about it, how much investment you need to make in monitoring so that you can get better information, and how much you need to focus on reducing the threats that are posed to that system. So again, that's not specific advice that comes for particular species or places, but the framework, the heuristic of understanding tipping points helps managers make decisions that can hopefully avoid going towards those tipping points and going past them. So shifting to sort of the multiple stressors and measuring impact, which are parts of my research that have been closely connected. This was some earlier work that I did that really changed the way I think about ocean systems and the kind of research I'm doing, where kind of acknowledging that in the past we really focused on individual stressors and the responses of ecosystems to those individual stressors. But when you think about multiple stressors and the cumulative impact of those stressors, you can get really different types of limits to the ecosystem, because small amounts of multiple stressors can actually be more harmful than a lot of a single stressor. So thinking about that bigger picture really helps you identify and measure where these limits to ecosystem state might lie. And so this is an example where we were able to go from not only identifying and measuring, but also mapping the way that these pressures to systems can lead to real changes in the structure and function of these ecosystems. And in this case, those bright red areas, we're able to ground truth as areas that have just seen dramatic decline in the state and condition of the ecosystems, whereas the greens and blues are still in relatively good condition. So we're able to map the way that cumulative impacts are affecting overall condition of marine ecosystems. But this framing of how we're interacting with the oceans was really a negative one, how humans are negatively impacting the oceans. But of course, the reason that we are having these negative impacts is that we are deriving benefits from the oceans. We're getting food from fishing. We are producing things that are good for our livelihoods but create pollution. We are changing the climate, but because we are producing goods and services that are valuable to people. And if you look across many, many policies, directives and mandates and documents from around the world, they talk about striving for a healthy ocean in which health is defined as the benefit and good of human communities as well as natural communities. And so this previous framing of just the negative impact of humans was not really useful to management in the long run. Well, it was useful, but not fully useful, because it really wasn't framed in the way that policymakers were trying to make decisions. They were thinking about, how do we understand and measure the health of the ocean ecosystems in a way that incorporates all the benefits that people gain as well as the negative impacts that we're having. So it needed to move beyond that cumulative impact framework into something that really focused on the broader understanding of ocean health. So this ended up launching what has now become the Ocean Health Index. And in scoping what was out there and what we were trying to achieve, we were looking for existing data and indicators and information that we could leverage and borrow. But of course, there's literally thousands of indicators that come from biophysical states of the ecosystem to ecological and habitat conditions to human impact on the ecosystems to composite indicators for various components of that, and on and on and on. And it's an overwhelming array of indicators that can be very confusing and hard for people to, and decision makers, to know what to do with. Which of these do we choose? How do we combine them? What do we make of all this information and all these indicators? And so our goal with the Ocean Health Index was really to try to create a framework that would guide which kinds of information to use and how to use it to come up with a composite single measure that would give a sense of the overall health of the ocean. And although ambitious, I hope we did a reasonably good job at that. And at a minimum, it helps provide, like I said, this framework to think about how to measure and ultimately map the health of the ocean. So what we were trying to do with Ocean Health Index is really capture in indicators this idea of a coupled human-ocean system, that nature and humans are interacting in positive and negative ways that influence the health of the ocean. We wanted to condense it all down into really easy to understand metrics that would be simple for decision makers to use and to think about, to make sure that we were incorporating sustainability into all these indicators so that we're not just measuring the health of the system today, but of the long-term future of the health of the system, to create a system that would allow you to track progress through time, which is really important for management and decision makers to know whether or not the decisions they make today actually translate into the change they're interested in tomorrow. And then to allow a tool to help simulate the actions that you could do and take to improve ocean health so that decision makers could say, well, if I do this, what will the likely consequence be for the overall health of the ocean? So we're about 7 years into the index now, and we have over 30 regions around the world. We call them OHI Plus efforts in all 7 continents that have taken off. Most of these are independent. They're led by government agencies or academics or conservation NGOs for different parts of the world, which is really exciting to see this sort of exponential growth in the use of these tools. Just a little background on all that we're doing with this project before showing you a few of the results. So we still do the global assessments annually. We release them in early December. So we just had our 2017 results come out a few months ago. We support and in some cases conduct these regional assessments, these OHI Plus efforts. In doing all this, we've developed code or a software, this toolbox that allows people to implement their own assessment much more easily, and it's all open source, free software. We have a ton of resources on our websites that we provide manuals, how-to manuals, frequently asked questions, resources that guide and help people to conduct their assessments. That's what we provide to everyone. In the back end, what we do to develop and support this, we still are pushing the science of indicators and each of the components of the Ocean Health Index to continue to improve and adapt to the best available science and information that exists. With any software, there's a constant continual development you have to do. And we're starting to do a lot of trainings of people from around the world to help them better use the resources that we provide. So here's a great resource if you're interested in learning more, ohi-science.org. Just a really, really brief overview. There's 10 goals. So the index is a single score, but you can break it down into 10 goals, and some of these have sub-goals that you can track separately if you're only interested in part of the overall ocean health. So food provision from wild-caught fisheries and mariculture, small-scale artisanal fishing opportunities, natural products like seashells, seaweed, sponges, etc., that come from the ocean that are sold instead of consumed, the storage or sequestration of carbon from natural habitats, the protection of coasts that come from natural habitats like coral reefs and mangroves, tourism and recreation that's provided by coastal and ocean ecosystems, the livelihoods and economies that these coastal ecosystems provide, the sense of place, the cultural identity that people have with the ocean, which here in Vigo I'm sure people deeply appreciate. We identify who we are by the fact that we live near the coast. The clean waters, that they're unpolluted, and the health of the biodiversity of the species and habitats that are within the ocean. So I think, if all of these were doing really well, people, I think, would undeniably say the ocean is a healthy system. If all of these were doing really poorly, I think we'd all say it's a really unhealthy system. But it's the differences in each of these goals and how they're performing that give a lot more insight into exactly what's doing well and not well in the health of the ocean. So here's an example of how we map this. For each country, we can give scores that range from 0 to 100 for the overall health of the ocean. You can see in general that many of the Southeast Asia, Africa, and Caribbean countries are places where things are not doing as well, whereas a lot of the remote islands and some of the well-developed countries with strong governance and infrastructure are doing pretty well. A lot of this is intuitive. Places that are at war or really impoverished and don't have a lot of resources are not likely to have the capacity to put towards managing and supporting healthy ecosystems. Places that are really remote and have no people or have strong governments to help manage resources are likely to be doing better. Because we've done this now for 6 or 7 years, we can track how things are changing over time. So globally, here's how individual goals and sub-goals have changed over time. The little lines show you how they've changed over time, and the dots are the overall average change in scores. Things aren't changing dramatically, a point or two, sometimes 3 or 4 points at most. And this is the entire planet. If you saw really large changes in scores for the entire planet, that would be surprising. It's too much to change in a short time. But this starts to tell you things that, sense of place, in particular through the increase in creation of marine protected areas, has been going up. Fisheries reform in a lot of countries is helping improve the fisheries score, whereas things like natural products and coastal protection that are coming from overuse of coastal natural habitats is declining those scores in the last few years. So this starts to give a bit more insight into measuring how things are changing and which aspects of overall ocean health are increasing or decreasing. And then you can further break this down. I'll just show a very few examples where you can look at, for each individual country, which are the goals that are improving, the ones that are on the right, and decreasing, the colors that are on the left. And you can see in these cases, these are the countries with the largest increases and changes in tourism, sense of place, and natural products, and food provisioning are the goals that are really driving the overall increases in these scores. And the ones that are seeing the greatest decline are seeing changes in the coastal livelihoods and economies and tourism and recreation. These sort of social economic driven goals are really the ones that have seen the declines in some of these particular countries. Again, this is giving information. It's not telling anyone what to do per se. It's not prescriptive, but it gives the kind of information to measure the impact we're having and where ocean health is increasing or decreasing and what kinds of decisions might help improve or mitigate the threats to ocean health. You can also look at it in these sort of, we call them flower plots, or these, it looks a lot like the planetary boundaries figure you saw earlier. And scores that are closer to the outer limit are the healthiest, and ones that are towards the inner part of the donut are close to 0 and unhealthy. So in some ways you might say that as scores get towards 0, that you're getting towards this planetary boundary. You've pushed things too far towards a completely overused and unhealthy state, and that might represent a tipping point where we've gone beyond a planetary boundary. But maybe it's not all the way in the middle. Maybe it's actually somewhere when you're pushing scores towards 20 or 15 or 10 where it's just getting too low to be sustainable. And we don't know yet. This is something that we're still trying to figure out, but it helps using this heuristic, this idea of the safe and just operating space. How do we then incorporate that into the Ocean Health Index to think about where these tipping points in the sustainable use and benefit of different aspects of ocean health might lead to unexpected changes in the condition of the oceans. Fortunately, there aren't too many places that have scores that have pushed so low on all the goals that we might be seeing these planetary boundaries exceeded in countries, but there are definitely places where particular goals are close to zero, and that might help give some insight into where we are approaching these key tipping points. But I want to dive a little bit deeper into the methodology of the Ocean Health Index because it really focuses on this idea of targets or reference points or tipping points and how we think about measuring, identifying and measuring where these limits to particular aspects of ocean health might exist. The reason this is so important with the Ocean Health Index is we have to say what a score of 100 means. We have to set a target of what an ideal situation is. For example, are we trying to get all species in completely unimpacted state so that their natural populations are as large as possible? Well, if that's the case, we basically have to remove all of humanity from the earth, and that's not possible. So our target, our reference, has to be tied to something that is meaningful for human use and benefit of the planet, but is definitely sustainable. So there's 4 ways that we operationalize these limits or thresholds within the Ocean Health Index. And I'll give you an example of each just to show you how we do that and what it means for understanding the health of different components of the ocean. So functional relationships, the most classic one is from fisheries science, where you're looking at a maximum sustainable yield. You don't need to understand that figure on the right, but this is how fisheries scientists think about the sustainable harvest of seafood from the oceans. You can harvest seafood up to a point, and it will the next year replenish itself, or over time replenish itself, and that allows for a sustainable harvest. And there's a threshold, a maximum limit to that, beyond which you've pushed the fishery into an over-harvested state that might collapse the whole fishery. So there's a lot of science that's gone into figuring out what this functional relationship, each species, each stock has its own functional relationship, and we can use that information to guide our reference or limit for the fisheries sub-goal of the Ocean Health Index to tell us what do we want the condition of all fish stocks to be in order for the fisheries part of ocean health to be fully sustainable, to provide food and the benefit to people, but in a fully sustainable way. So that's how functional relationships get incorporated into the Ocean Health Index. A lot of examples, actually, you don't have enough information to develop that functional relationship. It's really data intensive to be able to do that. And so we use spatial comparisons. We let the variation on the planet tell us what seems to be a best case scenario, what's possible in the world. So in this case, here are livelihoods and the wages of different coastal states in the United States. And here we can ask, given the average pay for coastal livelihoods in these states and the purchasing power, how much a home costs, how much a hamburger costs, what is the value of that wage? And in this case, the people in Massachusetts in the upper corner and in Mississippi in the middle there have the highest wages and purchasing power given the cost of living. So you use those benchmarks, those spatial references, to then say how all the other coastal states are doing. This is a spatial comparison. So a concrete example of this that we used in the original work was mapping the potential for mariculture, aquaculture in the oceans. We didn't know what the global potential was or could be, and so we just used information from statistics reported to the FAO, the United Nations Food and Agriculture Organization, on how much mariculture is produced in each country. Well, you all know China is the global leader in this by a long shot. They produce something like 60% of all mariculture in the world. So you can see, if you compare everything to China, China's doing really well. It's blue. And pretty much everything else is not doing very well because it's far from what China can produce. Well, this probably isn't the right actual benchmark to use.
You should try to do what they value best.
Yeah, well, I'll show you how we have solved this problem going forward, but you're right. China is always an outlier when it comes to this kind of issue. So you can see that there's huge implications for how you choose your reference point. In this case, our choice of a spatial reference point for mariculture was the only one we had at the time. We've since improved it, but it had a big impact on how we were scoring all other countries. This is what we do now, and I'll go into it in more detail, but we've adjusted for the area that's under potential aquaculture. We've created a buffer that removes China as an outlier, so you can see Norway and Chile and New Zealand and Canada, which have robust and in many cases more sustainable aquaculture scoring well. So there's ways that you can adjust and account for some of these known issues with using a spatial reference point to improve how we score different countries. A third type of reference point is a temporal comparison. So here's an example that's looking at mangrove extent globally that looks at the decline, and you can ask, well, where are we today relative to some point in time in the past? The challenge with this, of course, is exactly what point in time in the past are you looking at? So here's mangrove extent from different islands in Indonesia, and you can see if you go all the way back to 1800, that's probably roughly the natural distribution of mangroves, and it stayed that way in most cases until 1900, although it started to decline in Java. But then it declines further and further. Well, do you set your desired state of mangroves to be what it was in 1800, 1900, 1950, 1960, 2000? How do you choose a point in time? So the decision about what to choose as your reference point becomes really important, and there's two aspects to that. One is a philosophical one. What are we trying, like we can't get habitats back to a state where no humans were on the planet, but maybe pre-industrial or maybe pre-World War II or maybe, I don't know, we have to make a decision. And the other one is practical. You just often don't have data that go back that far. You can only go as far back as the data you have, and globally most of the data for habitat extent doesn't go back further than 1980. So we often use 1980 as our temporal benchmark reference point. And finally, there are just established benchmarks, and the best example of this comes from species assessments that the IUCN leads for risk status that tells you whether they're least concern, which is defined as zero risk of extinction, all the way down to extinct. So we then bin these into weighted categories of the extinction risk of species and assess all the different species within a country's waters and then give a weighted average for how the biodiversity is doing. Just to show you the decisions you have to make and the implications of them, so our general model says, well, there's a linear change, the red line, as you move from least concern status, where you're at no risk of extinction, to near threatened to vulnerable, endangered, critically endangered, and extinct. So each shift in extinction category increases your weight by 0.2 until when you get to extinct, it's really bad. You're gone. That's the decision. But you could have other forms where, for example, the top line, the kind of light green one, might be a case where people are really worried about changes in the risk status of species early. So if you see a species shift to vulnerable, you are really worried and you care a lot about this. So these are probably the more conservation-minded folks that they want any risk of any species is something they're really worried about. So here's a shift, a kind of a limit that is different than the one that we focused on. Conversely, you may have people who don't even notice that species have gone extinct or are becoming threatened until things really start to change, and that's that darker green line where you don't really shift to higher weights until you get to endangered or critically endangered categories for species. We don't know what the right answer is. It's probably individual. Each person is different, but you look at the global score, we got a score of about 83, the red line, when we did this the first time. Those different plots show what your global score would be if you use a different weighting. And it's dramatically different from ranging from 85 all the way down to maybe 73. That's a huge difference in your understanding of the state of global biodiversity. That's all dependent on your understanding of this nonlinear relationship between how people feel about or weight changes in the status of individual species. So there's a lot of science, both kind of natural science, understanding the risk status of species, but social science, understanding human preferences for different conditions of the ecosystem that influence our understanding of how to measure and then map the health of ocean ecosystems. Okay, shifting gears pretty dramatically, but it builds on that map of the aquaculture that I showed you. We really wanted to try to understand, can we better understand the potential or the capacity for ocean ecosystems to produce mariculture, not only for informing the Ocean Health Index, but for really guiding policy about if or where to encourage development of marine aquaculture. And a big part of that, of course, is motivated by the fact that the human population is growing, and we're going to need to feed more and more people on this planet, and there's a growing middle class that has a higher and higher demand for protein, in particular fish protein. And a lot of that is going to have to come from aquaculture. If you're familiar with wild fisheries, the capture of wild fisheries has been mostly stable since the 1980s, whereas aquaculture seafood has been growing, increasing linearly for the last 30 years. It's the fastest growing food sector on the planet. It's growing at something like 7 or 8% per year, every year for the last 30 years, and the projections are that it'll keep growing. Just 2 years ago, it surpassed capture seafood in the providing food to people, and it's expected in the next few years to surpass all capture fisheries used not just for food but for other purposes. So it's a sector that we need to be paying attention to if we're thinking about how to manage ocean ecosystems sustainably. You may not know it also surpassed beef. It's huge food sector on the planet. So anyway, really important. And just to emphasize again that wild-caught fisheries don't have a lot of potential to feed the planet. Most fisheries continue to decline. There's actual examples of improvement, which is great. But really, under the best case management scenario, the current wild capture catch, which is about 85 million metric tons, is expected to, at best, go to 100 or 120 million metric tons. That's the global capacity under the best case scenario of all fisheries being perfectly sustainably managed, which is extremely unlikely. So we can't feed the planet from wild-caught fisheries. We need to be thinking about aquaculture. So to model the aquaculture potential, we took some growth models for finfish and shellfish. How do they grow? How does temperature and dissolved oxygen affect them? So we take those models, we show spatial maps of sea surface temperature, dissolved oxygen, which limits growth, chlorophyll A, which is important for ocean productivity, especially for shellfish. Add in information about where existing marine protected areas are, where aquaculture is unlikely to happen, where global shipping lanes are that would create conflict for use and so also limit where aquaculture is likely to happen, where oil and gas development is that would limit things, and also depth, because currently aquaculture in the oceans is limited to shallower waters. So we build these models that show where productivity is possible. Then we clip away all the existing uses that are likely to limit where aquaculture can happen, and we get these maps of where aquaculture potential exists. And the bottom line is it's massive. There's huge potential in pretty much every coastal country to be able to grow a lot of seafood. And in fact, just 1% of the best area of that ocean ecosystem could produce 94 million metric tons per year. So that's greater than the current wild capture fisheries. So that's, you think about, if we're needing to expand ocean uses, we're not asking other users of the oceans to give up much space in order to be able to create a lot of food production from aquaculture in the oceans. It also creates a lot of flexibility and opportunity to site that aquaculture in places that has the lowest environmental impact and the lowest conflict with other uses. What's really interesting too is if you look at each individual country and their current seafood consumption, these countries can meet their current seafood consumption with often less than 1% of their own current EEZ. So certain countries that eat a lot of seafood need a bit more, 2, 3, 4% of their total national waters. But most places can feed their country, so national food security, with very, very little of their ocean waters. So every country has a lot of flexibility to feed themselves. So we use that information now to guide more informed reference points for the Ocean Health Index and that mariculture goal for where and how much aquaculture might be produced per country. But in thinking about aquaculture, we wanted to really pay attention to what its impact might be on the environment and how it compares to other food production so that we can really get a better understanding of the sustainability of aquaculture. Is it, if we put in 1% of each country into aquaculture, is that sustainable? What would the environmental impact of that be? How much food would it produce? And how would it compare to other food systems? So in the last few years, my research group has really gotten into understanding how aquaculture fits into the global food production system comparing to all other kind of food systems. And I'm going to show you just one example of this that we've been working on that builds on kind of this understanding of comparing different food production systems. So this is work by Dave Tillman and Dave Clark that was published a few years ago that looked just at the greenhouse gas emissions of different food production. I mean, obviously, vegetarian diet is really good, so you're going to have some of the lowest greenhouse gas emissions from crops. But you can see wild-caught fisheries and aquaculture have higher emissions, but cows, beef production is by far the highest. But you start to see how aquaculture compares to other food production systems. But there are many other ways of measuring this. There's the feed conversion ratio, how many pounds of food it takes to produce a pound of the food you can eat. And in fact, farm-raised fish is now the best on the planet. It's nearly 1-to-1, which is far less than for cattle in this case, beef. You can also look at the pollution. We've just started working on this. So if you have really intensive marine aquaculture, there's some nitrogen pollution and a little bit of phosphate, but much, much less than beef. You may be familiar with all the methane and other manure-based pollution that comes from beef. You can look at water use. So a lot of agriculture uses a lot of water. Shellfish marine aquaculture uses almost no water, right? Fed aquaculture uses some water because you have to grow the feed that gets put into those fin fish. But anyway, it's another way of thinking about how different food systems compare. But we were really focused on this one, land use and land conservation. So 40% of the land on the planet is used for agriculture. That's a lot. We've converted a lot of our landscape into growing food. It's something over 5 billion hectares that are in use for agriculture, whether it's growing crops or as grazing lands for sheep and cows and other animals. And almost 4 billion of that is just for livestock. So cows in particular and goats and sheep are the main uses of agricultural land for grazing. So we wanted to understand what are the land conservation implications of these different food scenarios in the future. If aquaculture is going to grow exponentially, what does that mean? And what does it mean versus other growth scenarios where maybe middle-class diets are really preferring beef and pork because it's a status symbol and they want to be eating that instead of shellfish, for example. So this work is about to come out. Here's the total amount of biomass that's currently consumed and produced for different food systems. You can see the reds are the beef, dairy cows, pig, and sheep. The yellow is chicken, and the blues and greens are your marine fish and freshwater fish from aquaculture. We looked at 3 different scenarios where current trends in diet stay the same, but the human population grows. So that's business as usual to 2050. How much we're going to almost double, well, at least a third increase the amount of biomass that's needed to feed the planet. And then we looked at 2 different scenarios. One where we shifted the increase in protein production away from beef, pigs, sheep, goat, and chickens and shifted it towards a mixed use of freshwater and marine aquaculture, and another one that focused on increasing just marine aquaculture. These are just bounding scenarios. Probably none of these are reality, but they give you a sense of if we change nothing or if we really push towards shifting increases in consumption towards marine and freshwater aquaculture, what that would mean. So this is just setting the stage. What we can then look at is what that means for the amount of crop that gets put into the feed for these animals. So aquaculture now is fed a lot of soy, wheat, corn, and other grains that's mixed in with things like forage fish in order to feed the fish, the shellfish, not the shellfish, the finfish. So you can see there's a huge increase in the amount of crop feed. It's 2.5 times the current use under business as usual because of that would be driven by large increases in cow and sheep and chickens and pigs. And under the mixed and marine examples, it's roughly the same amount of feed because you're feeding the finfish these different components of crops that go into that. But what does that mean then for land use and land conservation, these different scenarios? And what we can see, the upper right, this plot C shows you the total cropland that would need to be used, and that you're seeing an increase no matter what, because you're increasing the amount of crops that are needed for feed. But you can see in the maps that most countries are actually able to save land, conserve land under the seafood scenarios compared to the business as usual, because you're not converting land, as much land for crops as would be needed to feed pigs and cows and chickens. So you're still gonna, there's no way to avoid converting some land, but you're gonna spare a lot more land in a lot of countries under the aquaculture scenario. So you can see almost every country is in the light blue or dark blue, which means if you pursue scenarios that are promoting aquaculture, you're gonna save a lot of land. So this is a case where growth in aquaculture can actually serve land conservation objectives in a way that people may not be paying attention to. Just to note that total cropland use is exponent to the 8th. What isn't in that is all the grazing land, and you can see here that's to the exponent 9th. Most of the land, like I said earlier on, is for grazing. And when you account for grazing land, which of course you don't need for feed for aquaculture, but you do need for sheep and goats and cows, pretty much every country gets a lot of land that is spared from conversion because under marine aquaculture scenarios, because you're having a lot less grazing land needed. So this is just one way of framing the comparison between different food consumption scenarios. It doesn't mean that aquaculture has zero impact on the planet, but it means that given that we have to feed the planet, it's one means of doing this in a lot more sustainable way. A lot of this work is being motivated by a new initiative I've launched with some colleagues called the Conservation Aquaculture Research Team. So under this, we're pursuing a lot of interest in how to develop best practices and opportunities for offshore aquaculture. For a lot of reasons, we think it's the most sustainable way of doing marine aquaculture. Understanding how climate change will impact aquaculture and the interaction with wild-caught fisheries. And then, like I've just shown you, examples of how aquaculture fits into these global food systems. So I know that's a really almost superficial look into a lot of these different projects, but I wanted to frame it around this idea of how do we understand sustainable limits and thresholds, how do we measure them, and where possible, how do we map them in a way that translates into information that can really inform and guide, hopefully, decisions. So I showed you these examples with planetary boundaries where we mostly identify where these limits might be, and then ecosystem tipping points where we identified but also tried to measure in some cases. When we think about sustainability limits, whether it's within the Ocean Health Index or the cumulative impact we're having on planets, or within aquaculture, we're trying to actually measure and to begin to even map these. And then like in that example with the comparative food systems or with different components of the Ocean Health Index, we're really trying to measure the interactions among these different components of how we interact with the oceans. and what that means for overall ecosystem sustainability. We'd love to chat with folks afterwards and while I'm here, but there's lots of resources online that we make available for all these different projects, both through my own research website, but also, like I said, through the OHI Science website or this cart.science website, and also through the center I direct, the National Center for Ecological Analysis and Synthesis. So I encourage you to look into those websites, and if you don't catch me while I'm here in Vigo, please definitely reach out, and by email I'd be happy to stay in touch. With that, I'll end and happy to take any questions. Thanks.